is Passport Necessary, a podcast dedicated to growing up as a TCK and living with it now that we are adults. And today we are going to be discussing the topic of Mayday slash Beltane. Um,
hmm
so I will be very honest and upfront. I had to do research on this topic because I didn't really know too much about Mayday or Beltane. Did you have more of a history with it?
Not so much, but it's something that's interesting. It appears in quite a few different places. I mean, May Day in England is something I don't think people do it too much anymore. But you have the whole thing with the maypole, which essentially is you get people. It's a tall pole, and you get streamers and stuff like that, and ribbons which come off it, and you dance around it.
Hmm.
And so the whole idea of dancing around the maypole comes from that, because everybody does it in unison, and there are sort of like different ways of dancing around the maypole. You can kind of like braid the ribbons around the maypole. You can make spiders webs and all sorts of stuff. There are different dances that people will do, and some of them more complicated than others. And essentially, it just involves skipping around it, mostly. It's always the 1st of May when that's done. Um, for May Day anyway, and I'm not sure how old the tradition is, but it does exist in England still to an extent.
Hmm.
People are aware of it, and people will even use the phrase sort of like people will get together and dance around a particular maypole, which basically means they all get together and agree on something and then dance around it. Essentially, it's kind of it's kind of considered to be a little bit sort of what's the word I'm looking for? It's a bit of a derogatory remark if somebody goes, oh, they're dancing around that maypole. Um, it's considered sort of like maybe sort of as a slightly childish and a little bit sort of maybe infantile even. I think it's suggested that people will sort of like it's because it is a group activity dancing
Hmm.
around the maypole, which is a nice thing actually because it is a celebratory thing. It's just basically the first day of summer. I mean, this is in certainly in England, May the 1st is considered the first day of summer.
I was going to say when I was
Um,
doing research, it said that it was halfway between the spring equinox and the summer solstice.
yeah, it pretty much is, and that makes sense really because it also is kind of like considered to be the opposite to Halloween. So certainly, I know that like within the Celtic cultures, or what they call Celtic, you have Halloween, which is like that's the end. That's where the end of the harvesting season and the growing season. So that's when you kind of like get your cattle in. It's when you get all the crops up and finally, you know, um, reaped and all that sort of stuff. Whereas Beltane is kind of the beginning of that season when you can start taking your sheep. Well, the sheep are always out, but cattle out and stuff like that. And you can, start the process of growing food and all that sort of thing.
Hmm.
I'm not sure if it involves the same sort of idea of um, the barriers between um, this world and sort of the spirit world breaking down, but I think it does.
It does.
Um, yeah, it's because there's certainly not a piece of trivia or such, but did you ever see the original version of Fantasia that Disney did
Yeah, I have
from the
actually.
1940s? You know that one where they have the devil on top of the mountain?
Yes. Yeah, that
That,
actually scared me as a kid. I
yeah,
was a little
yeah,
afraid of it, and now that I'm older, I'm like, Chernobog is awesome looking. But as a child, I was
yeah.
like, that is so scary.
But that particular piece of music was written for what we would call Beltane.
Oh, that's so interesting that they went
So
with such a dark theme.
well, it is. That's exactly what the music is about.
Hmm.
The devil comes out and all sorts of stuff like that because then the barriers between this world and the spirit world break down.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and Mussorgsky is a Russian composer, so I'm assuming that they have some sort of similar idea of that in some certain parts of Russian culture. So I'm sure it actually might be a more European thing than we think, because obviously people did move around, and you do have people were called Celts,
Mm-hmm.
safely in quotation marks, all over Europe.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, the word Celt just essentially is a, I think, Greek word that just means kind of those people to the north. It doesn't really
Stop it. Is that
specify anybody.
true?
Yeah, the first I think the Greeks called them Keltoi, and it's a word that refers to people all the way from essentially sort of a Romanian area, I suppose, all the way through Germany and then up through France and then into Britain.
Hmm.
It generally refers to that. I mean, even sort of like because they have like stuff in Switzerland. There's a lake called Latenne,
Mm-hmm.
and there's a particular kind of set of weapons that were found there, and they call them Latenne swords because these are swords that were made and thrown into this lake, and they were considered to be Celtic as well,
Hmm.
because they shared similar art and culture. So I'm assuming that maybe over the years, some of this stuff like got carried on in certain areas and didn't carry on so much in others. I mean, I don't know like what it's like in France because I'm assuming that they might have had similar cultural ideas there, but do they do that sort of thing in France?
I
Is there a
mean,
May Day celebration or something?
if they do, I don't remember it.
Mm.
I don't really remember seeing it. But
Mm.
I did want to say, like, when I was doing research, one of the things that was brought up was that both Halloween or Samhain and Beltane were the two times of the year where the world of the our day-to-day life was super close to the spiritual world, where like there
Mm-hmm.
was no barrier anymore. They were intertwined because it was seen as
Yeah.
two different worlds that sometimes would cross into each other through like fairy rings or portals or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
um and gateways. But during Beltane and Samhain, they were like the two times of the year where that barrier basically was non-existent. um
Right.
which is interesting because there's a lot of purification rituals that are actually embedded
Mm-hmm.
within Beltane. So, bonfires, which in many different
Yeah.
cultures are seen as a purification
Yeah.
ritual, dancing. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so, there's just a lot of like things where it's like, oh, okay, like this was seen as a time of purification, rebirth, fertility. Like, a
Yeah.
lot of people, what they'll do is what they used to do and still do now there, because there are people who practice Beltane now, is they will wear flower crowns, or they'll put flowers in
Oh
their
yeah. Yeah.
hair, a symbol of fertility. And then dancing, another symbol of fertility, because it's like, hey, look, I can move, and then we can move in
Yes.
other directions. um, and then,
There was just on the point of fertility, there was some research done into this because more modern interpreters, like people who wanted to do this for, well, they say religious purposes, like Wiccans and Druids and all that sort of thing.
mhm,
Um, some academics went and looked into it because they said, oh, what they did was that they'd all kind of like not quite have sex parties, but everybody would go out and have sex on this particular day, and as a part of the celebration of the arrival of spring. And so people would kind of go, right. So that would mean through all the records of everything that we know, what we could do is we would be able to work out from the 1st of May, we've just got to go and see if there's a boom in babies 9 months later.
mhm.
So they went and checked this, and there isn't one. So they
Oh,
obviously weren't doing what people thought they were doing. So
interesting.
it doesn't happen in the way that people say it does. That's the research I've heard. So um, we kind of do. The one thing I know is interesting about this sort of stuff is people like to project ideas that they like to have about the past onto it,
Mhm,
and then treat it if it's real. And sometimes it's not entirely true. It doesn't matter. It's funny because we always go back to looking at the past in order to justify what we do in the present. And it's like, if you want to do that sort of thing, like kind of go, well, we're going to have this fertility ritual and we're going to go off and have fun with each other later on, I'm putting it politely. Basically, you can do that if you want to, but don't go looking to stuff that where we can show that it didn't happen.
mhm.
I mean, it's fine if that's what you want to do, but I mean, it's interesting that so much stuff we know very little about what Celts and those sorts of people were doing because the only kinds of people that we have writing from are Romans,
Mm-hmm.
particularly Julius Caesar, who wasn't particularly reliable on everything.
Yeah.
Though he did say that places like Britain were very important for the Druidic cultures in terms of they were the places where most of the Druids came from, or
Mm-hmm.
where people who were Druids would go to learn. Apparently,
Yeah,
so
it's hard looking back at history, especially when so much of history gets lost when it comes to
mm,
documentation. And then a lot of times things get based on oral history. And the
yes,
problem with oral history is that try telling the same story to different people and get it right every time. You're always going to change
yeah,
a bit of detail, even if you don't mean to. That's just
mm,
how we are. When we tell stories, there's a little bit of an addition to it, or a flourish, or a change of word. Even actors
mm,
do it all the time. You memorize a script,
yeah,
there are still times where you're going to embellish or change the words, which changes the meaning slightly. So
yes,
I think that's what's so hard with trying to be, as I'm putting it in quotation marks, accurate as possible based on
yeah,
historical evidence, because our historical evidence is kind of limited. And then you might
yeah,
claim, oh, well, we have this evidence that says this is what it was. And then historians will
Yeah.
go back and they're like, nope, don't know where you got that evidence from. This
Yeah.
does not exist. Sorry.
Yeah. And it's always a problem with like looking at sort of, particularly like because finding the origins of a custom can be really really difficult at times. Because
Hmm.
certainly, I think certainly within Britain and the United Kingdom generally, you have huge problems with sort of the erasure of what you would be considered Celtic cultures.
Hmm.
Um, Mostly because they tended to survive in places like Ireland and Scotland.
Hmm.
And then the problem is that, and it's not just Scotland, it's northern Scotland, it's the Highlands. That's where the Celtic culture survived, whereas the sort of southern um, areas of Scotland tended to be more from sort of like what they would call Anglo-Saxon traditions or something like that. Like they Saxon kings had invaded into southern Scotland, so that used to be part of a kingdom called Northumbria and all that sort of stuff. And to the north, you had people like the Picts and stuff like that. And then later on, they became the Highlanders were there, and they did have a different culture to the people in the south. And the problem was is that they tended to like to cause trouble, and they basically their culture was wiped out in the 1700s because not all of it, but a lot of it, partly because they decided to kind of back a guy they called Bonnie Prince Charlie, who was the son of was it no, I think it was the grandson of James II. Can't remember if it was his son or grandson. I think it's grandson. And they lost at the Battle of Culloden.
Hmm.
And then the British government basically just said, right, we're not having this ever again,
And
and
just
basically
wipe
just
them out.
banned the speaking, yeah, banned the speaking of Scots Gaelic. They banned all sorts of stuff. They basically just tore apart those parts of the society that were problematic, and that was in northern Scotland, whereas the southern Scots were a bit more bit happier integrating into things
Hmm.
because they tended to be Protestant. They tended to be supporters of well closer to the power bases of England anyway to an extent because their royal family was they were happier supporting a royal family that was Protestant than they were Catholics.
Hmm.
So
It's harder to control people when they're further away and they have different ideas than
yeah,
you.
yeah, and so that's the thing is kind of bringing it back to the Beltane thing is that basically you have a kind of cut in the continuity.
Hmm.
So a lot of stuff is in Britain anyway is being revived from older traditions. So the Welsh kind of look back to some of their stuff. The Scots are looking more and more back to their history,
Hmm.
and it's particularly Highland history they're very keen on. More so because it is more distinct.
Hmm.
I mean, it's not entirely what they do, but I mean, what we recognise as being Scottish is what would really have been a more Highland type culture, like the kilts and all that sort of stuff. That's what the Highlanders were more likely to do.
Hmm.
So, and all the tartan and stuff like that as well. So that it's slowly being revived after. Well, it's not that slowly, but I mean, it's been revived after generations, and it's an interpretation of what happened before, and it's a kind of reimagining of the past.
Right. It's hard
And so
for
you
it to
get
be
that.
direct because that directness doesn't exist. It was gone for so
Yeah,
long.
yeah. I mean, it's deliberately, certainly in Scotland, it was deliberately stopped.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah, it sucks, and unfortunately, I think it is something that happens in quite a few different cultures. I know that
hmm
in Louisiana there was a time period where French was basically not allowed. Like you
Right,
couldn't speak French. You couldn't learn French in school. Most of the people who spoke French were grandmothers. And they
right, yeah.
spoke their own version of French because it got mixed with different versions of English and some Caribbean languages, and
hmm
Spanish got thrown in there as well. So, like, Louisiana Creole and Cajun is very different from French or English. Like, it has its
Right,
own sound and language, and that's because for a while it was banned. You couldn't speak
right.
it. And actually, there only has been within the past couple generations a resurgence in French culture and learning about Louisiana's
Uh,
French roots because it was gone for so long. And I think it's a very interesting dichotomy between, and this does fit with May Day because there are more and more people who are trying to celebrate May Day or Beltane and find meaning within it. But it's
hmm,
this dichotomy between making it matter for you within this modern world, but also trying
hmm
to stay in touch with the old roots of what this tradition
Yes.
is, but knowing that you can't 100% fit that old tradition because you don't know 100% what happened then because we don't have that information.
Yeah. I mean, also the other thing is one thing we also got to remember is that the majority of us, even if we haven't had like a break in our cultural history, we don't really know what it was like. The majority of people alive now don't really know what it was like in 1917, say, or 1918 when the First World War ended, just to take a particular date, which is obvious to remember
Yeah.
for Westerners anyway. Um, it's it we wouldn't recognize the people, we wouldn't recognize the times, we wouldn't recognize any of it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, some of it would be vaguely recognizable, but if you look at the footage and stuff like that, the Victorian era, it doesn't look anything like what we have now.
Mm-mm.
Like there might be the odd famous building that happens to be in some of the photographs, but the area around it doesn't look anything like what we would expect.
You.
Particularly thinking of London, if you look at that, we don't we have the historical evidence,
Mm-hmm.
but we don't. In our minds, what we're doing is we create an idea of what it might have been like.
Mm-hmm.
And
We're
we like to. Yeah, sorry.
No, I was just gonna say we're creating the context. We don't know what the
Yes.
context was, so we are creating context based on what we know, and it's through a
Yes.
modern lens. So it's always going to be a
Yeah.
little off.
Yeah. And we're telling ourselves stories about ourselves more than anything else. Where do we come from?
Mm-hmm.
We're trying to attach our identity to that history, in a sense, and trying to create. I think we all do this. We try to create a lineage or a lineage of ideas that comes through the generations to us, which connects us to a particular time or a particular place or to a particular culture.
Mm-hmm.
It's it's a funny, it's an interesting thing to do, but I think we all do it in different ways. And I think the thing is, it becomes more. I think we find it more odd or difficult when a group of people does it when you know there's been a break,
Right.
because you can say that's not correct, and we know it's not correct. But then, in a sense, it doesn't really matter because I mean, if your idea of Beltane is essentially to have a celebration where you get together and say it's great, the growing season's back, everything's good, we can go outside again without it being too cold and all that sort of stuff. It's kind of like, you know, why not? I mean, why not have a day to just say, "Yep, this is the start of summer," or "This is the start of the good times," and let's enjoy it. I mean, it's partly what Beltane was about in the first place. It doesn't really matter whether you have the gods or not, does it?
Yeah,
I mean, for some people it does, but I mean, you could make it part of your culture.
for sure. And actually, referring to the gods, the one thing I was able to find is that Beltane
Mm.
is tied to the Celtic sun god Belenus, which I thought was interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Which makes sense for the bonfires that it's attached to a sun god.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought that was a
Yeah.
really cool like little tidbit of information I was actually able to find because I was like, there's like we've been saying, there really isn't that much like evidence that we can find, so we're kind of just
Mm.
speculating. We're just spitballing here. We're figuring it out as we go along. Um, I think the one thing we need to be careful of is being aware that we are spitballing instead
Mm-hmm.
of saying like this is factual truth. It's like, well, we don't know what the factual truth is. But if we're
Yeah.
honest and we say like, hey, we're kind of spitballing, we think this is what it is, and if you're cool with it, we're going to roll with it. And I think that's a
Mm-hmm.
better and healthier way of approaching looking back at history and trying to
Yeah.
bring that into the modern world.
Yeah. Definitely. Because one has to be aware of when one is constructing things,
Mhm.
and culture is a fluid process anyway. It changes all the time. I think it's interesting how we try and lock it in position. The thing is, it evolves and changes just as people do.
Oh yeah,
So.
for sure. Oh my gosh, I had the moment where I realized that like I know so little about my French culture as a younger
Mm-hmm.
half French person because I was watching there's a show on Netflix called The Circle, which is
Mm-hmm.
a really interesting show if you have access to Netflix and want to watch it. It's really fascinating. It looks at how like we use social media as a platform to communicate with each other, but it's a reality show, so it's fun. Um
Mm-hmm.
and they have a version that was set in France. So I was like, oh, I'm interested. I want to see how it works in the French version. So I started watching it and I realized that I was actually spending quite a bit of time looking at the subtitles because I
Mm-hmm.
could understand a good portion of what was happening, but actually there's so much new slang and terms that I didn't grow
uh,
up learning or using that I honestly was sometimes lost as to what was going on, and I had to rely on the subtitles and the context of what was happening and the
Hmm.
and how they were sounding, like if they sounded happy or angry, to understand what that word was, because I
Right.
had never heard it before. And that was one of those moments where I was like,
Yeah.
I identify partly as French. I identify myself also as an
Hmm.
American, but that was a moment where I was like, "Oh, I'm part French, but I'm not all French," because
Yeah. Yeah.
I definitely did not know what was going on.
Yeah.
There were just so many terms where I was like, I have no idea where that even comes from. Like the context of
Mm.
that slang was lost on me. Like I just didn't
Yeah.
know what it was. So it was very weird where it was like, "Oh, this is French, but I am so unfamiliar with what's happening."
Yeah. Well, there's even like sort of some slang in sort of like that appears as sort of like you notice it sort of like even within England. I think there's a difference. And I'm talking about England specifically now because that's where I've been. Um, but there's a difference in slang from the north to the south. There are words that you hear in the north that you just won't hear in the south,
Mm-hmm.
and it's obvious slang. But the thing is, you have to sit there and work out what somebody is saying. Is like, what does that word mean? What does that word mean? And then you start to realize what it means because because I speak a very sort of like formal, comparatively formal English. So sort of having to look at how somebody communicates with somebody else, it can be quite difficult. There've been sort of like strange occasions where somebody will sort of like somebody will be interested in trying to get some information about where I'm working. They want to ask about a service, and they will deliberately send you messages in a broad Yorkshire accent. Like they type like they're speaking to their friends, and you're kind of going, "We're not going to understand. Some of us don't come from here. You got to give us a chance."
Please, we want to help you. We want to be able to communicate. That's
Help
so
us to help you.
That's so funny because it is an example of how culture shifts, because a lot of
Mm,
times it's referred to as like English culture, but English culture in itself is fractured into a bunch of different little things, just like American
yes.
culture is not one monolithic thing. It's a bunch of little
No.
things that build up into a bigger culture. But even within that, like there
Yes.
are people who are from New York that do their own New York thing, that if someone from LA would look at it, they would not recognize it, or they would
Yeah.
have a vague understanding of what it was. And just think that's
Yeah.
so interesting, because we refer to entire countries or entire cultures as one specific unchanging thing, and that's just
Yeah.
it's not true. It constantly is
No.
shifting and changing.
Which is what I find interesting about so much stuff when people talk about culture. It's always the thing is that it seems like everybody, like no matter who they are, seems to think that sort of culture is almost can be or is frozen in time,
Mhm.
as if it doesn't change, as if it has never changed. What we understand now as culture is what people have always understood to be culture, and so you can say that's our culture, 100 years ago, and it's still part of our culture now. And I don't think it would be for most people. I think we wouldn't, if we went back to look at it, we wouldn't know what it was. I mean, we would find it really difficult. And if they came forward, I mean, they'd probably be perfectly capable of learning, as just as we'd be capable of learning if we went back. But I think it would be really difficult if you were to
Mhm.
transport someone who was, say, an adult and send them back to somewhere else, and then say, right now you've got to deal with this. And say, well, it's not the same culture I'm used to. I suppose it's a kind of a thing that maybe being a TCK, it means that you can think about culture not just in place but also in time, in a
Yes.
way.
Absolutely. And I totally agree with that. And another example I have for me is I lived in Korea when I was very
Mm.
small. I was about, I want to say 6 or 7. I was a little bitty
Mm-hmm.
one. And now that I've gotten older, I look at Korea and I'm like, that's not the Korea I remember when I was little.
Mm.
Because Korea has
Yeah.
become this bigger, very modernized, high tech, like lots of things are going on. It's definitely changed and altered slightly from what I remember when I lived there and I was younger. And it's so fascinating because when people say, like, oh, well, you lived in Korea, what is it like? I know that they're thinking about it from this modern context of what's going on in
Mm-hmm.
Korea
Yeah.
now. And part of me has to say, like, well, I was there when I was little. And that was
Yeah.
20 years ago. It has
Yeah.
changed dramatically since that time. So I can't speak on what your image of Korea is because I've never seen that version of Korea. I haven't
Yeah.
interacted with it since I was that 7-year-old child. And so it's
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
interesting pattern of like we have been to different cultures and we have seen snapshots of that culture in that time. And it's fascinating
Mm.
how, as you move away from it, you love it and you find something very beautiful about it. And there's all these different experiences, but there's also this realization of when I go back, it'll probably be different. That was actually something that
Yes.
happened when I took my partner to France. I
Yeah. Yeah.
was
Yeah.
taking him to all these places and I was like, oh my gosh, this place that I loved is gone. It doesn't exist anymore.
Mm.
It was like, well, when were you last here? And I was like, well, 2 years ago. And he was like, well, there you go. That's why you didn't see it. Not 2 years. It was like a couple months. But even within that time frame, things shift and change. They happen in our
Yeah.
cities. We just don't notice it because that's our everyday life.
Yeah. I mean, it's depressing, really. But I mean, with the pandemic and stuff, you notice a lot of changes. Like in the city I'm living in York, you can see that a lot of shops, retail shops, have been shutting down over the past year.
Mm-hmm.
So, brands like Debenhams, their shop shut. I mean, these are British sort of brands, and there was another clothing store called Topshop, which got bought out, and now that shop's closed. And I remember being able, like, when I was coming to on holiday to Britain in the summers, I think from about I can remember going there from about the age of 14. It
Mm-hmm.
was the same shop; it was always there. I went there last summer to buy some stuff, and now it's gone. And it's just like it's a shift, and that's going to be a cultural shift as well because people won't go there anymore. It won't be a brand that people use and all that sort of stuff
Mm-hmm.
because things have changed. I mean, it's partly because of the pandemic, but a lot of bad management as well. That's
Mm-hmm.
part of the reason it's gone bust.
Yeah.
But it's that sort of thing, and it's just like kind of going back to like Beltane and stuff like that. I think reviving certain old cultural things is a good idea as well because I think one of the things that's interesting in Britain anyway is that, or the UK in general, is that people refer to sort of like what would be normally considered a national holiday as they refer to them as bank holidays, and they always occur on certain points in the year, and I have no idea when they are. I've never learned, but the thing is because they don't see they, they don't feel tied to an event. They're not tied to like, okay, so why don't we have a holiday when the equinox is, because then it's marked, and then why don't we have a holiday on Halloween, and why don't we have a holiday on Beltane, and why don't we have a holiday on the summer solstice? Because we have one at the winter solstice,
Mm-hmm.
but we don't have, and we have one for New Year, but we don't have them through the rest of the year. So we have this whole festival season that sort of starts in December and ends on the 1st of January. And then we don't have any more. We don't have any other kinds of festivals. And the thing is, the holidays were given. It doesn't, I don't think it creates that sense of community, whereas I think something like Beltane would, because it is about community.
Mm-hmm.
Christmas is about family. New Year, as everybody knows about that. I mean, it doesn't matter about religion or anything on that sense because it's just like it's marked the calendar. We know when that happens, and we agree that that's when it happens.
Mm-hmm.
So the thing is, if you did that for all sorts of other festivals, I think it would bring more people together. Just because like having bank holidays, I suppose it's nice because it's totally secular, so nobody has to feel like it's referring to one particular religious group. But at the same time, it's not attached to anything at all. It doesn't feel attached to like a an event that you would see in the year, something that you can say, so this is happening on this day.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
It has no
Easter
cultural
works a bit like that,
meaning.
but yeah, exactly. Apart from it's just there. So I just think it would be nice if people like the idea of having Beltane and reviving it and using it is a good idea to me because I don't really understand why we don't do it. And May Day, I think why not?
Yeah. You actually mentioned something before we started recording, and I thought it was so funny because I genuinely thought it wasn't a real thing. Um, is the Morris dancers, is that what you called them?
All right, yeah. I'm not entirely sure whether they're completely associated with this particular day, but it seems like the kind of thing that you would have. It's
Yeah, so
it's strange. I mean,
I had
they.
heard of Morris men specifically from a novel by Terry Pratchett called
Mhm.
I Shall Wear Midnight, and it's part of a mini series within the Discworld like saga that he wrote where the lead character dances with the Wintersmith, who's like supposed to be a representation of winter. and
Mm.
she dances with him in a Morris Men dance. And when I was reading it, I was like, well,
Yes.
this is kind of like a fantasy novel. This is probably something that's within this world. And then when you said that, oh no, they're like real things, I'm like, oh, so
That was
it's just
real.
English culture. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, there was a because they have like Morris dance teams. I suppose that's the way you put it, or dance groups maybe is the best way of putting it. And there was because they have like these summer sometimes like music festivals and stuff like that. So you get Morris men going to them because it's just part of like a folk music thing. So they do it. And apparently, I don't know where in England it was. It would have been in England, but there was a pub sign that says "Everyone welcome except for the Morris men. They cause too many fights." Because apparently, what was going on is that two groups of Morris men would meet, get drunk, and then start fighting each other.
Oh my gosh.
Apparently, I don't know how true it is, but like, because the thing is that they've got all these bells strapped to them, so you can hear them a mile off. So you know when one group comes towards another group, you can hear them. And the thing is that also part of the Morris dancing involves using big sticks that look rather like large rolling pins, and they knock them against each other.
Okay.
And so basically, if a bunch of people turn up with that sort of thing, you're probably going to be in a bit of trouble.
Oh no.
If they decide to have a fight. I don't. It's apparently true. I don't know how true it is, but apparently it is. It was something like that. Anyway, I'm not sure how closely associated it is with sort of like New Year. I'm sorry, not New Year, but May Day and Beltane. But I mean, it's something that exists, and it's again that's something that people claimed was really old, but it apparently isn't as old as they think. It's probably not even medieval because they claimed it went back to a sort of like pagan time before Christianity, and people said we can't find any evidence of it whatsoever. It's another example of the same thing, and it's particularly an English thing that people say goes back generations and all the way back to whenever before history was written, and it's not true as far as anybody can see.
That's so
Because
funny.
normally you would find some sort of record of something somewhere, like in a parish somewhere, you'd find a record of people doing this sort of stuff, because the church would normally keep quite good records, and there's a church in every village, so somebody in the village probably could write. So they might have been taking notes on stuff and what was going on, and also the lord of the manor would have been interested in what's going on and all that sort of thing. So, but there just apparently isn't any evidence of it until more recently. I don't know how recently, but it's not as old as people make it out to be. But people want it to be older because I think it justifies it, which is interesting.
That is interesting. I just love that image of guys strapped with a bunch of bells on them getting into a very loud fight because I'm sure those
Yeah,
bells were a jangling.
yeah, definitely. It would be quite funny because those things you had when those bells you had when you were a kid, like they would have like these sort of, I don't know, they're about sort of I don't know, they're about 2 centimeters across. Those bells you could get, like they had like several on them and like a stick and you'd shake it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the kind of bell that they've got, and they're just like like they got them strapped around their legs, so when they move their legs, it just jingles. So the thing is, when they're walking down the street, you can hear them a mile off because they don't bother taking the bells off. It's really weird because sometimes I'm at work and I just suddenly hear the bells and I'm going,
Ah,
"What the hell's that?"
the
And it's just
Morse
like,
men are
oh, there's a
here.
Morris man going past. Yeah, it's really weird.
I love that. That's such a great image. Um, but yeah, so that's our kind of weird tangent on Mayday and
Yeah.
Beltane. But we hope you enjoyed listening to this.
Mm.
Just so y'all know, we are on Twitter at Passport Nessus1. So that's Passport NECESS1. We are also on YouTube. You can find us on
Hmm.
any wonderful podcast home, such as Spotify or Apple Podcasts. We are also hopefully going to be releasing a Facebook group soon. So we absolutely want
Hmm.
you to join that. We're very excited to be releasing it. Um, and please, if you have listened to our episodes and you've enjoyed them, leave us a comment, a review, like our videos on Facebook or on YouTube. We're not on Facebook yet, but definitely do that because the more interaction with it, the more people get to listen to our fun podcast, which we really enjoy recording and have a
Hmm.
blast. If you
Yes.
can't tell from the number of times I cackle in each episode.
It is good
So
fun.
until next time, bye, Marcus.
Right, bye, Lena.